Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing 1, 2, 3. If anyone can hear me, if you could reply and let me know. I'm having a little bit of a problem with my audio, so. Hi. All right, we're it. Trying to figure out if I've even got my system working or not. Yeah, I got a new microphone and a new camera, and I don't think this will work, but I'd sure like to find out. But you guys hear anything this week? Since yesterday?
No, but I today did a search for her father in Dallas.
Mhm.
I found him, it's the attorney who popped right up, so I think I'm just gonna send him a message.
That's a good idea.
Because I know that, she thinks the world of him
Wow.
and has kept in contact with him, so I thought I'd just let him know that we're concerned if he hears from her, he just let us know that she's okay, because we just don't know.
Getting rid of that when the cameras are smaller than the tripod.
Yeah. It gets really hot, and I'm not sure why it gets so hot. All right, so Grant, I thank you for telling me you can hear me, Grant. Does it sound any different? I'm using a brand new microphone and camera, or they're not brand new, but they're new to the system. So Grant, tell me, give me a message how it sounds quality-wise, what you would say compared to the last. Okay, that's what I wanted to hear. Thank you, Grant.
responded to the
Yes.
has the microphone work?
Yeah.
What are you doing?
I need this. It's just, well, with the camera set up like this, actually, you can just pop it loose. Then unscrew it.
Taking all of my finals.
You good
All but one.
It feels
Which I
different.
know I did really badly on, but I'm still somehow gonna pass the class. Super into my math.
According to your math, which is what you didn't pass, so.
Which is, I did pass like barely. Cause I did all the homework and got all A's on it. So it gives me just
Yeah, I guess I better. I'm a slobberer too. Let's go ahead and get our Bibles out. Let's go over to Joshua chapter 20, which is where we're at tonight, Joshua chapter 20. Jenny, you got your hair cut. All right. Just see a camera on you, by the way. So, see, the camera's right on your head. So, but I can tell your haircut.
It's not looking at you, don't worry.
Yeah. So, no, it's not. But didn't mean to confuse you. Joshua chapter 20 is where we're at tonight. We're actually a short chapter. Going to be visiting a topic we've talked about in the past. I thought it might just be worth our time to really camp and dig in deep on the subject that we're going to be hitting tonight. Next week, we're going to be talking about one of the big mistakes that nearly started a civil war, and I think that's interesting. And then the 2 weeks following that, Gregor is going to be our Joshua person. He's going to be giving us Joshua's farewell addresses, both of them. So we'll be ready for that when that time comes. Before we get started, Anthony, can I ask you, would you lead us in a word of prayer?
Most wonderful, Almighty God, and Heavenly, thank you for this opportunity to come and study your word. We pray, Father, that Brian will have an open heart and remember what he studied. We ask that we all will have an open heart and think about the things that he said, that the words from you that we know it's so edifying to us, that we apply it to our lives, that we be more like you and like your son, and that we can go out there and teach your truth in this area. We ask that you also be with the teachers, and they teach the young kids, and that you will be with the kids, that they will open their hearts and their minds and to think about the things that are being taught. We give thanks for your son Jesus and everything in his name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Thank you very much. So let's go to chapter 20. Not very long chapter, but we're going to be jumping around a little bit tonight because we're going to go back to Numbers and Deuteronomy as well. But let's just go ahead and read the chapter. I'll tell you what, I'll read it if that's okay. We'll start off in verse 1. The Lord also spoke to Joshua, saying, "Speak to the children of Israel, saying, appoint for yourselves cities of refuge, of which I spoke to you through Moses, that the slayer who kills a person accidentally or unintentionally may flee there, and that they shall be your refuge from the avenger of blood. And when he flees to one of these cities and stands at the entrance of the gate of the city, they shall take him into the city as one of them, and give him a place that he may dwell among them. Then if the avenger of blood pursues him, they shall not deliver the slayer into his hand, because he struck his neighbor unintentionally, but did not hate him beforehand. And he shall dwell in the city until he stands before the congregation for judgment, and until the death of the one who is the high priest in those days. Then the slayer may return and come to his own city and his own house, to the city from which he fled." So they appointed Kadesh in Galilee, in the mountains of Naphtali, Shechem in the mountains of Ephraim, and Kirjath Arba, which is Hebron, in the mountains of Judah. On the other side of the Jordan, by Jericho eastward, they assigned Bezer in the wilderness on the plain from the tribe of Ramath in Gilead from the tribe of Gad, and Golan in Bashan from the tribe of Manasseh, and not die by the hand of the avenger of blood until he stood before the congregation. So, we really like to talk about the cities of refuge for a couple of reasons. Number one, it's actually a substantial part of the law of Moses. It's in Numbers, it's mentioned briefly in Leviticus, it's in Deuteronomy. Here in Joshua, it's been mentioned. It's in Numbers, it's mentioned briefly in Leviticus, it's in Deuteronomy. Here in Joshua, it's been mentioned. Time kind of part provided as well as this. So let's talk about the city of Jerusalem, and we talked just a little bit about that. We want to keep this land as their own. So it's kind of interesting how that was. We have our 6 cities that were given here: Kadesh, Golan, Shechem, Ramoth Gilead, and Bezer. And it's kind of interesting when you look at it. So the cities themselves that were established, themselves, some of them are kind of well known. Some of them are kind of well known. Some of them aren't very well known at all. Starting off with our city on the wall. But one of the things that, that's just one of the things that they're struggling or they're having going on is that these cities were put up on hills, and maybe there's some significance to that you might think about. Just tell me if you had thoughts on that to think about. But Kadesh, that first city, was, other than that, not a remarkable city. We know it's one of the cities that the Assyrians took early on whenever they came down and started carving off those northern tribes. Our next city is the city of Shechem, and that one we do have a lot about in the Bible. Do you remember what two of Jacob's sons, Levi and Simeon, did to the people of Shechem? Remember? Yeah, they killed him. The actual man named Shechem, and the city is older than him, so he was probably named for the city, had fallen in love with their sister. They were offended by what transpired there, and so they went out and they killed these guys. So it's interesting that these things kind of went, that this city had that reputation. What else do we know about Shechem? Anything else you can think about Shechem? Shechem's kind of interesting. I put a picture here of an Egyptian stele that's a story that Shechem was a city that the Egyptians talked about a lot as really not liking because they had to go to war with it a few times. And so it's kind of interesting. So some people think maybe Shechem was a Hittite city. The Hittites had a long war with the Egyptians, so they were thinking maybe that was the case there. So with Shechem, that was a city that had a lot of history to it, a lot of things that had gone on. Go ahead, Ryan. Yeah, that's right. Very good. And one of the important ideas, Ryan, is that this is going to be important for Gregor in a couple of weeks. But do you remember what they did at Shechem? I know it's a tough question, but yes, the 70 sons of Gideon, and what happened to them? They were all killed there, right? What's kind of interesting, though, is that the Bible says they were killed on the stone. It doesn't actually specify what the stone is, but when you read Joshua, you find out Joshua had left a memorial stone there. So it's kind of interesting to tie those events together, how that would transpire. A little bit further on in Joshua, we're gonna be going back to Shechem, and someone important is going to be buried there on a plot of land that had been purchased there. So that's something we're going to come back to here in a couple of weeks. Next city we had is the city of Hebron. City of Hebron, of course, was the city given to whom? Do you remember? Last week we talked about it. And he said, I want that city because there are giants in it. Caleb, yeah, boy, Caleb's a guy I'd like to have met. The guy that says, yeah, giants, well, that's the one for me, So that was his city, but it's also a city of refuge now going to be given here. Golan, kind of interesting about Golan because I assume, and I'm not sure that the Golan Heights, it's in the same area. So the Golan Heights today shares its name with that city, but not too much known about it, not too much mentioned about it. Ramoth Gilead is a place that's mentioned a few times in scripture. One of the things when I was looking at pictures of Ramoth Gilead was I was just amazed how pretty it was. You don't think of beautiful rivers and green areas in this area, but there's some really pretty areas up there. And I was thinking about this, looking at these pictures, thinking, if I were the tribe of Manasseh or Reuben or Gad, and this is what the land would have looked like, maybe, that does look pretty good. It did look like a place that would have been a great place to settle and to set yourself up. And our last city, the city of Bezer, kind of interesting. Nobody really knows for sure where Bezer was. It's kind of a guess that it's down in the southern area. Maybe it's down towards where I just forgot the name of the mountain. What's the mountain Moses went up to look over? Pisgah. Thank you. But usually it's drawn or being in the area of Mount Pisgah. So that's something we know about this, and that's about it that we know about it. So let's talk about what these cities of refuge were all about. And let's begin by talking about who is this city for? Who are these cities of refuge for? Now, I guess you could answer that more than one way.
Levites.
The Levites, so that's one way to say this. It was one of the Levitical cities. They had 42 cities, so these cities were there. Who is this city for in a legal sense? Yes. And the Bible uses an important term here. It calls him the slayer, or sometimes the manslayer. The manslayer. And that's how they always refer to it. One of the things I think that's interesting is because it's a very legal sense. You know, in a court document, you refer to people as plaintiffs, as defendants, as, different parties involved in suits, and they always are used for very specific words. So the point is, in this case, this person is referred to as the manslayer. Now, what's unique about the manslayer? Can somebody go over to Numbers chapter 35? Anyway, I don't think I want you to read the whole thing, but let's go over to Numbers chapter 35 for just a second. Can someone read, how about verses 16 through 22 or 23, 16 through 23? Go ahead.
But if he strikes him with an iron implement so that he dies, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. And if he strikes him with a stone in the hand by which one would die, and he does die, he is a murderer. The murderer shall surely be put to death. Or if he strikes him with a one-hand weapon by which one could die, and he does die, he is a murderer, and the murderer shall be put to death. The avenger of blood himself shall put the murderer to death. When he meets him, and he shall put him to death. If he pushes him out of hatred, or will lie in wait, or hurls something at him so that he dies, or in enmity he strikes him with his hand so that he dies, the one who struck him shall surely be put to death. He is a murderer. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death when he meets him. However, if he pushes him suddenly without enmity, or throws anything at him without lying in wait, or uses a stone by which a man could die, throwing it at him without seeing him, so that he dies, while he was not his enemy or seeking his harm, then the congregation shall judge between the manslayer and the avenger of blood according to these judgments.
So what's interesting here, in Joshua, he says this is a guy that killed somebody because of hate. Now in Numbers, he actually elaborates how do you discern if it's hate. So what kind of things did you see there? What were some of the indications that it was an intentional malicious crime versus a accident or a negligent crime? What were some of the indications? Premeditation, lying in wait is one of the terms. And
having a weapon. Having had a weapon, if you had tools that were implements of death.
So what's fascinating is the number two was that it depended on what the item was that you used there. So that's really interesting too. That number one, it was, did you lie in wait? Number two, what did you kill him with? And there's several specifications, an iron weapon or certain kinds of tools that you would use. That there were some things that the implication sounds like it's implied that there was maliciousness involved. So I thought that was really interesting, that it would depend on the weapon that was used or the tool that was used or whether or not he was lying in wait. So that was one of the things that was very interesting about that. Anything else? How do you determine maliciousness? We haven't got to it yet, but there's one other thing that needed to be involved here to determine if this was a malicious killing. Anybody want to guess? What does the Bible constantly say? In the New Testament, it says it a lot too, that you need 2 or 3 of these. Witnesses. So you actually are going to require witnesses as well. So that's an interesting thing, that without witnesses, you can't do it either, right?
I just think too, that seems to imply too that there's some sort of formal review by the elders or something. It's not just the manslayer saying, hey, I'm just going to do this. It looks like there's some sort of community review.
Very interesting. I want to come back to that because I think that community review that you're talking about there, that as it talks about the elders of the city coming aboard in this, I think that's a really interesting part of this process. Now, who's the person that's supposed to do this? To put them to death? The avenger or the avenger of blood. Here's something interesting about the word avenger of blood. The word avenger gets used a lot in the book of Ruth, but our translators translate it differently. Anybody want to guess what it is in the book of Ruth? Redeemer. It's the same word. I thought that was very interesting, that the word, the avenger of blood, is the same word that's translated as the redeemer. It's the person that makes things right, so to speak. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting. That, you know, in the positive sense, here was Boaz and he was going to redeem Ruth. In the negative sense, though, the blood avenger is obligated to be the person to put this to death. Specifically, it also refers to the Redeemer who is a close relative. And in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 25, verse 48, both of those passages in relating these things indicate that what we're talking about is that this is supposed to be a close family member that brings this about. Now, what I've always thought is interesting is that there really isn't much of a choice in it. So in other words, if I, you know, reached out and I struck somebody, if I hit Michael, his brother Brian, today's his birthday, isn't it? His brother Brian, whether he wanted to or not, would be obligated to come strike me down. That this was something God expected that had to happen. I thought that was kind of an interesting thing as well to think about there. So that was a striking point. What do you got?
Well, I find it fascinating, even way back to Cain and Abel, God talks about blood crying out for revenging. I mean, this is something that God values.
Yeah.
Which, you know, part of my modern brain has structural difficulties with this.
So I want to come back to that. That's actually going to be one of our thought questions here about that, the very thing that you talked about there, blood desiring vengeance. And that really is an interesting idea, I think, worth spending a couple of minutes on. Once they do this, they get that you're supposed to flee to the city. And this was brought up just a moment ago. Ryan was talking about this. In fact, Ryan, would you do me a favor? Would you go over to Numbers 35 and read verses 24 and 25 for us? So you flee to the city, and the idea is that when you get to the city gates, there's a trial, so to speak. There's a trial, and it's like I said, it's not like Ryan said, it's not just a guy saying, I didn't do it. It's a sophisticated trial where certain things are to be ascertained. Go ahead, Ryan. I believe so. I hope so.
The congregation shall judge between the manslayer and the avenger of blood according to these judgments. So the congregation shall deliver the manslayer from the hand of the avenger of blood, and the congregation shall return him to the city of refuge where he fled, and he shall remain there until the death of the high priest, who was appointed with the holy oil.
So who's supposed to be there in this trial? And I put down like the elders of the city, as it's listed, I think, in one place. But who else is there? You got the manslayer. I think you said it. Somebody said it. And the avenger. Kind of a neat court setting. You got your jury. You got your prosecution. You got your defendant. You know, very much like a jury that we would create today. Like I said, there's a sophistication to this process that's interesting. You have to describe the implements that were used in this crime, you know, or this action. Was it an implement that implies murder? And as well, you have to have these multiple witnesses. In Numbers chapter 35, verse 30, it says, if you've just got one witness, somebody said it, not enough. They're going to be acquitted. Interestingly enough, it's not enough. You had to have two witnesses. Stan makes a comment here about that. Two witnesses. And Stan goes on to say, you know, that the idea that the blood avenger has to do this, he says it's kind of like the father and mother who have to put a son to death for being rebellious. That's some pretty hefty requirements of the law. So it really was something else to think about. Can somebody go over to Numbers 35 and read verses 31, 32 for me? 35 verses 31, 32. 35 verses 31. Go ahead, George.
Moreover, you shall take no ransom for the life of the murderer who is guilty of death, but he shall surely be put to death. And you shall take no ransom for him who has fled to his city of refuge, that he may return to dwell in the land before the death of the priest.
So this was another thing I found fascinating. What were you not allowed to do? Yeah, you couldn't. First of all, you know, it's kind of interesting in Anglo-Saxon society, they invented this concept of what they called weregold, that if you killed somebody, you'd have to pay their family for having taken that person's life. And we actually have a similar concept in our law that if, you know, somebody is killed and it's unintentional, that you may owe a debt. But in this case, you can't pay. You can't pay for somebody, either number one, somebody who's guilty not to be put to death. And number two, what I thought was also interesting is you couldn't pay to get out of the city of refuge early. In other words, you couldn't, if you had been found, you had done it accidentally, you couldn't pay somebody and say, hey, why don't you let me go? So even if, I struck Michael and I was brought, it's going to be confusing when I say Brian was trying Brian, I just realized. But when I'm brought out there and they say, well, it was an accident, he didn't mean to do it. And this Brian can stay here. If I leave, well, the blood avenger is still obligated to come get me, so I thought that was kind of an interesting thing too. And I can't in any way say, hey, can I just pay off the debt or something like that? There was no redemption price in this. So that was a profound idea as well. Go ahead, Stephen.
Seems like there's a real elephant in the room here. A person who has killed someone accidentally, which happens all the time, is, has the option of number one, being tried, and if found guilty, he's killed.
Mm-hmm.
And if he's found innocent, he has to spend potentially the rest of his life in the city of refuge for something that was an accident.
Mm-hmm.
So I really struggle with that.
Well, so what I would say is, so Stephen, I get what you're struggling with, and I think it's a good question. Is it really fair if you did something accidentally? Let's say everybody knew it was an accident, that you should be restricted in this way. Well, first of all, my suspicion is this system is designed that for a lot of people, it might not be that easy to convince people it was an accident. Hey, I was out hoeing and, and the hoe slipped and I hit Michael in the head. And there might always be people that say, well, Brian, you were always jealous of Michael and, that great goatee he had. So you just don't know. There might always be a question, for one thing. Personally, I've known lots of people that were in accidents and somebody who's injured or died, and there's maybe a suspicion to that. So to some degree, there might be a problem with that, with this sense of that. So I think that, this tries to alleviate that by saying, he has to stay here. But number two, I'm not sure it really was that bad of a thing to be told you have to go to this city and dwell here. For one thing, like I said, your inheritance, your inheritance still awaits you wherever you're going to go, but it's not as though you're destitute or poor in this city. You would have opportunities to work and to do the things you normally do. I don't think it would be all that terrible of an inconvenience, especially because one of the points I want to make is that these were rather established cities. I think that one of the things that's interesting about these cities is they weren't just little tiny hovels that you say, I'm stuck out in the middle of nowhere. They were central cities that might not have been a bad place to be. So I think, priest, the symbolism here is you can't redeem yourself. And so I think maybe the point is we're supposed to learn the idea that, if you have blood guilt, you can't redeem yourself. Only the death of the high priest can. And then, of course, Stan makes this comment here, after the death of the high priest, the manslayer returns. That's the thing that allows him to go back home. And the blood avenger's job is done at the death of the high priest, as though the death of the high priest atones, settles the call of blood, so to speak, as though it takes care of that. Go ahead. Oh, you did. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was thinking about today in society, when somebody gets 1 or 2 drinks after work, and then they're driving home at night and they hit somebody by accident. Well, and kill them. Well, he didn't do it on purpose.
Right.
And so, but it was an accident, so you should just say, be careful next time. No. What happened? He's on trial. Usually he's punished.
Yeah.
For that. Even though he didn't attempt, he didn't do it on purpose, but still there's consequences to his action. And so at the same token, you see what happened in the city's refuge, and if you kill somebody by accident, you had an opportunity at least to say, what? I'm not in prison. I'm free. I can't be in place of my home or the city that I'm from. But at the same token, I'm not locked up.
Yeah.
And that's a bit different.
Yeah.
And so he still, the individual have a right to freedom. And they can be able to live their life as a free person.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point. I think your illusion of somebody driving drunk, our society would punish that person rather strongly, but that person in this case, because it was unintentional, would fit the category. I think that's a very interesting observation. I hadn't thought about that, but that's a real good point. Stephen Root brings up a good point online. He says, I can't remember. Does it say anything about if the Avenger dies, would there be a new blood Avenger? That's a great question. I hadn't thought about that, but my one thought would be, and I don't know that there is an answer to that, but one thought would be, like in the story of Ruth, if the Avenger is also the Redeemer, that basically you just probably would go to the next closest kin. That would be my guess as to what would happen. But I'm not sure. That's a really great question. And I don't know if anybody has an answer to that, but that really is a good question that I'm not too sure about the answer. So got a couple of questions to think about here. First of all, why would these cities of refuge be given to the Levites, perhaps? And, well, they were given to the Levites, but why would they be given to the Levites and not, say, the people of Gad or Reuben or of the tribes? Why is it that the Levites are responsible for these cities? And like I said, it might be kind of obvious, but what do you think, Stephen?
One of my thoughts was that the Levites were scattered among all the tribes, at least the 48 cities that I was reading about. And they didn't actually have their own, necessarily their own property, but they were in sections within all of Israel.
Yeah.
So they would be accessible.
Yeah.
And I can't remember the other reasons.
Oh, what do you got, Gregor?
Well, there are a couple of things I can think of. A, they'd be more or less neutral.
Mhm.
They wouldn't be under the, shall we say, the leadership of the other tribes.
Okay.
So you're taking the offender out from under the authority of the tribe that he offended.
Mm-hmm.
Under most circumstances, he's not going to go and kill the Levite.
Mm-hmm.
You know, at least that's what we're gathering. Plus, the Levites would know when the high priest changed.
That's a great point. Actually, that was not one I thought of, but the Levites would know when the high priest changed, probably better than most.
Because communication is not like you don't get an email back then. Oh, high priest changed, so you're free to go. But they would have some form of communication where they would know sooner than everybody else.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that, but one thing we do know, we find this in 1 Samuel chapter 1, is that the Levites would rotate their service at the temple from place to place. So like Samuel's father was from Ephraim, and had come down to do his service at the temple or at the tabernacle. So that's kind of an interesting point to say with that rotation, you'd probably have people coming and going all the time. Didn't think about that one. What else do you got, Stephen?
One other thing, I'm not sure if this is quite right or not, but I was reading that the Levites were all walled off. I mean, it seems to me that all the cities have been
Walled off, okay.
Yeah, but they made a point where there's a lot of talking about how they were walled off.
That's really good, Stephen. Did you hear what Stephen said? That was actually something that I was kind of, we might bring up here in a few moments. But Stephen says, it seems one of the interesting things about these cities, and this kind of goes back to the idea that these aren't nominal cities, is that they were required to have city gates and things like that, a walled city, that a city that had a protection. Say, like I said, if the blood avenger was overly zealous in what he wanted to do, that the city itself offered some protection as well. I want to come back to that, Stephen, because that's a really good point. Go ahead.
Another thing with the Levites too is they should have known the law.
Yeah,
They
Stephen.
should have been like a lawyer.
Yes, Stephen Root makes that comment. Stephen says these are the guys that are the keepers of the law. So remember, there's rules that they have to follow here, and it makes sense that the people that were the keepers of the law, Stephen makes this point, were the ones that would know how to handle this procedure of doing this. So that's exactly right. Stan makes a similar comment. He says the Levites were the one who knew biblical law and had been given the duty to make sure this justice was practiced. So, again, we're not just seeing that the city of refuge is created. We see that in a sense, the Levites are being given because they're the ones in the city, they're given a responsibility to be proper administrators of justice in this case. So that's a really great observation to think of. These are all good comments, good things for us to think about. The concepts of, the lack of prejudice on the part of the Levites, their knowledge of the law, their knowledge of the things that they were supposed to do, all of those things make great points why this was something given to the Levites. Who originally made the selection of the cities? This is an easy question. Way back in Deuteronomy, Moses had chosen these cities. These weren't randomly selected by drawing lots like the tribes were. These were things that had already been established. And that kind of leads us to our next point. What were the things that these things were established for? What what kind of characteristics were there? Well, for one thing, let me jump here for a second, kind of looking at the map. What do you see in the map? Something that makes these good choices. What you might pick these cities.
Pretty evenly distributed.
Yeah, very evenly distributed. I did a little, circle where I'm at in Israel, and more or less, you're almost equidistant from some city at some point, wherever you're at. So they were very well distributed. Now, there was something else I found in looking at this, and that is, how do you get there? And one of the things that I thought was interesting is the most ancient roads, these cities sat on. Didn't know that till I was looking at this, that there was 3 major roads that ran north and south through there. There's the Way of the Sea, sometimes called the Way of the Philistines. There's the King's Road or the Royal Road. And then there was a small road in the middle called the Way of the Patriarchs. And it kind of ran through the mountains, if you would. And these cities sat on those roads. And so that was something that really struck my interest, that these very ancient roads, these cities were right there, which again kind of speaks to the fact that these were established cities. These were cities of some character and strength in them. So going back to that question then, what else do you think are some features of the cities that would play into their selection? What else do you have? Stephen brought up a great one about having walls. That makes sense. Go ahead. The roads they had to build. In fact, that's the second question here to think about. What are some things that they had to do? Well, one of the things in Deuteronomy 19 verse 3 says they had to build roads to these cities as well. That was fascinating, that they would actually have to build roads up to those cities. So that's very good. Stan throws that passage up here in the chat. You shall prepare roads for yourself and divide into 3 parts the territory of your land, which the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, that a manslayer may flee there. So, I found that very interesting as he describes this, and he makes the point to say, you don't want this journey to be so long that the person is lost because of the length of time. I would say large enough to accept refugees, large enough somebody to take care of himself. So that also is a great point. And again, so like before the trial, just in general. What do you Ryan, you bring up Brian chasing Michael. Michael was yelling and Brian ran him down. Well, with just one witness, I hadn't really thought about that, but it might put some obligation on the city. Somebody had to be in prison maybe before they were tried, or there might be some other obligation. I hadn't thought about that, Ryan. The blood defying the land. Maybe start off with, where did we first hear about that? And Gregor told us. Gregor, where is it? We first hear about the idea that blood cries for vengeance. Yeah. So when Cain kills Abel, 10, the blood, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Requires justice. It cries for justice. Now, metaphorical or literal, as far as a spiritual sense of that, blood is a mysterious thing. It was something they weren't allowed to drink because life is in the blood. So I've always found that fascinating. Stan threw up a comment I hadn't grabbed out of Psalm 106. Talking about shedding innocent blood, the blood of the sons and daughters, they sacrificed the idols of Canaan. The land was polluted. The land of Canaan had been polluted with the blood of these sacrifices. So I've often thought that's an interesting term, the idea of pollution. We think of pollution very differently than they do in the Bible. And one of the things was that innocent blood pollutes land. That's a really interesting point. Anybody have any thoughts on this? With the idea of the blood that cries out? Just a powerful idea. Go ahead.
Something that I had been thinking about was that probably the same way that those signs polluted the land with the innocent blood of men, women, and children, and other sacrifices. Israel was to cleanse the land through execution against enemy inhabitants who were guilty of every form of spiritual contamination. The interesting thing about Cain and Abel at that time actually had been, as far as I understand, there was no law against murder. During the time of Cain and Abel, which came later in Genesis 6 with Noah. Genesis 9.
You know, what's interesting is, you know, is there a law about murder? Because God held him accountable, we infer that there's some kind of law, but, you know, there's certainly no stated law. As you said, until Genesis and, Genesis 9, where God gives them the covenant of blood and tells them, you know, that, you know, what the requirements of that are. And that's really interesting, Stephen, to kind of consider those characteristics as well. I've often, well, we don't have the time, but I'd say I've often wondered if Cain really understood the idea of killing his brother, what that even meant, since at that time nobody had died yet. So, you know, what did he understand he was doing? Ryan? Yeah, that's a very interesting observation. You know, again, it goes back to the question of how did Abel know how to offer a better sacrifice? Is it inferred because of what God had done in the garden, using the life of the animal to cover up sin? Was it something God had specifically told him that we don't have a record of? So it does seem to be a knowledge of things that we're not exactly sure how they had, if they, you know, were intuitively able to figure it out, or it had to be specifically told. That is a great question. Go ahead, Stephen.
I'm sure that they have a sense of right and wrong and their knowledge, but there was no law by God not to murder. And so then they become a very guilty conscience and all the rest. But God had not specifically said anything to murder. So that when Uzzah, for example, touched the ark, it had been said no one was to touch the ark. The Philistines could touch the ark without even.
You know, one thing too, though, is that, like I said, what's complicated about this idea is that oftentimes we say that there's also a concept of law that's inferred. Romans chapter 2, he talks about how the Gentiles, by their nature, obeyed the law and became a law unto themselves. So one of the reasons God destroys the earth is filled with violence. So God is punishing the earth for its sinfulness, and yet, you know, like I said, is there a direct command about, you know, the absence of violence? Not that I know of. So there sometimes is the idea of an inferred law, and we even go to the idea that one of the ways God reveals things to us is a necessary inference. There might be some sense where there's a necessary inference about that. You know, the concept when Genesis 9, he goes to, you know, why you can't do this. He says it's because man is made in the image of God. Well, you know, that was a knowledge they already had. So maybe that was something they were supposed to infer. It's a complicated subject, and like I said, we could go a lot into it, but for the sake of time, I'm gonna move on. Let me grab this next question. It's an easy one. How long does a manslayer stay there? Till the high priest's death. So, you know, and you said it could be a long time, but one thing is, it might be the case that your high priest kind of went pretty quickly, you know, that for one thing, you didn't get to be high priest when you were 25. You usually didn't get to be high priest till you were much older. So you're really talking about, you know, the probably less than a generation of movement there sometimes. So that might move pretty quickly depending on things. But still, it could be 2 or 3 decades. It might be there. It's hard to say. So that's exactly right. Last question is the one I wanted to spend the most time on, but Craig, how many minutes have we got? 2 minutes to say, what's the parallel here? What's the parallel here? So the idea, of course, let's start off with guilt. What is our guilt according to Romans 6:23? Because of our sins, what? We all fall, that's Romans 3:23, we all fall short of the glory of God, and the wages of sin? Death. So number one, the first analogy is, if we've sinned, we stand like the slayer, that there is a corruption, a stain of sin, and the wage of sin is death. We're to be put to death. Who is the avenger? This is kind of neat to think about. Who is the avenger? God is the avenger. I will avenge. Do not take revenge on yourself. God says, I will avenge you. God is the avenger. Now remember, what's the other word that the avenger is? Who's the redeemer? Also God. That's kind of a neat way of looking at that when you consider this. Now, the idea of fleeing for refuge. If you go over to the book of Hebrews and you read Hebrews chapter 12, he says we have, not Hebrews 12, Hebrews 5. It's on your paper. Anybody have your paper in front of you? It's at the bottom of our notes. I can't remember now. I just forgot the passage. Hebrews 6. Okay, I was wrong on both counts. So congratulations, George. Give yourself a point for stumping the chump. So Hebrews 6, he says, we have fled for refuge And I can't believe that he's talking about this idea of the city of refuge and fleeing because of guilt. And so we fled to this place. Well, when we enter into the city gates, that the blood avenger's ability to take our life is over. Of course, we are tried whether or not we're found innocent or guilty. But in our case, when we enter into the city of God, how do we enter the city of God? When we're baptized, we enter the city of God. And what happens to our guilt? Yeah, it's taken away. It's taken away. But here's the thing. If we were to leave the city of God for the coming of the high priest, change that a little bit, what happens to us? Yes, we can find ourselves once again, that the avenger comes back and strikes us. So it's fascinating that the avenger and the redeemer, it's the same word. While we're in those gates, he's the redeemer. But if we depart, he becomes the avenger yet again. And so it's just a really fascinating contrast to the church that Jesus built. It had to be something that we were supposed to see. Thanks so much for great comments and questions. As we wrap up here, next week, we're going to pick up the next 2 chapters. We're going to be talking again about how a little misunderstanding nearly leads to a civil war. Thanks again.